Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Noah, Dayenu's New York organizer. It's so great to be here with you all. We're going to get started very soon. What a moment we're in. I'm so grateful to be here in community and in movement with you all tonight. Um, I am Dayenu's New York organizer, and Dayenu is a multi-generational movement that confronts the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. And we're here tonight with friends and co-sponsors, RAC New York, the reform movement's advocacy and organizing arm in New York, who are in the midst of a multi-year campaign focusing on tackling climate change in New York, their Climate Covenant campaign. So we are here today. We're going to do a bit of a run through of climate legislation in our state to energize you to take action together as a New York Jewish community in this critical legislative session. We're going to start in a moment with a kavanah, some intention from Rabbi Peter Stein from Temple Brit Kodesh in Rochester. Then we're going to talk about where we are in this moment in New York, what opportunities we have, why it's so critical for us to act, and then we're going to move into taking action together. We will close with some music from cantorial student Gabriel Lehrman at Hebrew Union College, so make sure to stick around till the end for that. And without further ado, I'm so honored to introduce Rabbi Peter Stein from Temple Brit Kodesh in Rochester. So take it away.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Erev Tov. It's really good to be together. And I want to offer this thought as we begin tonight. In our Torah portion for this past Shabbat, which were the first chapters of the book of Exodus, we read the description of Moses encountering the burning bush. As God calls to Moses from the bush, Moses declares, "Hineni, here I am." This is the same response that it's given in each generation when we discern a need and proclaim our readiness to step up and take action. Hineni, here I am. For us, this is a moment where we somehow, some way will say, Hineni, here I am. I am here and I'm ready to act. We come from different parts of the community, different parts of the state. We each have our unique and personal reasons for calling out Hineni, but together we can also say, Hinenu, here we are. We are here, ready to learn and ready to raise our voices. Together, there is incredible potential in what we can accomplish. When God hears Moses say, Hineni, he replies by saying, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground. The Hebrew phrase is Admat Kodesh. There's no definition or explanation given for what exactly is Admat Kodesh, holy ground, but it is an image that endures and compels us to action to this day. Every inch of the land, every inch of the sky, every inch of the water is holy. And we have a profound responsibility to care for what God has given us. I thank you all for being here tonight and look forward to what we will be able to do together to protect and preserve the Admat Kodesh, the holy ground.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Stein, for those really lovely words. Blessing, and I want to move us now into talking about the first part of our agenda for tonight, which is the question of why work on climate change right now in New York. I was remiss, I didn't introduce myself. My name's Ben Elkind. I'm the lead organizer for RAC New York. And this is a question that I've been thinking about ever since I first started working with RAC New York a couple of years ago. One of the things I've sort of wondered was, is there really work to do in a state like New York around the climate issue? And also the climate issue is a global issue on a scale far beyond New York State. So why would it matter what we do here?
Are you expecting anyone?
And so I wanted to share as a way of starting to think about that. And can we mute if folks are able to mute if you can, that'd be great. I wanted to share a story that of a different state that's helped me to think about the question of why a place like New York might matter. This was a story that I learned when I was in policy school, and it is admittedly a little wonky. So we're all going to put our policy school hats on for just a second and bear with me. So here we go. We're going to rewind. It's the Obama administration in 2012. And one of the things that the Obama administration does is they enact a very significant policy to tackle climate change. That was to say that car makers had to sell vehicles with greater and greater miles per gallon over the years ahead. The idea being that if cars are more efficient, they use less gasoline, they put out less greenhouse gases. So here was New York Times coverage of this policy being enacted again in 2012. The expectation was that because of this policy, it would take a huge chunk out of the overall American emissions. And we know that the United States is a huge emitter of greenhouse gases globally. So this was a really important thing that the administration did. Okay, now we're going to fast forward 6 years. The first Trump administration in 2018. And one of the things that the Trump administration does to counter the Obama administration and their sort of policy legacy is they take this policy about increasing miles per gallon for new cars and they roll it back. So this was covered in press extensively that the Trump administration rolled back these requirements that cars are more efficient, use less gasoline, put out fewer greenhouse gases. Now, a lot of the climate groups that were out there at the time, prominent think tanks, that sort of thing, were truly dismayed by this policy. So one of them, which is called the Rhodium Group, it's a well-respected climate think tank, asked the question in one of their articles, was this the biggest climate rollback yet? Okay, now we're going to keep being in 2018. We're going to move our brains to the state of California. The state of California responded to the Trump administration rolling back this key climate policy, and they got pretty angry. In fact, so angry that there was press coverage of how angry they were. The Washington Post covered California blasting the rollback of this climate policy. Now, a reasonable question that we might think about, that we might have had back then, that we might have now, is who cares if California is mad? It's just one state in the big union, even if it is a quite big state. And as California's elected officials were sort of thinking about who might care, do we actually have any ability to impact this issue, there were a couple of things that they were able to reflect upon. Number one, California's economy is huge. In fact, if it was a country and it's like on its own, it would have the 6th largest economy of any country in the world, just the state of California. And related to that, Californians, it turns out, drive a lot of cars and they buy a lot of cars. So now what does that mean? That means that the state of California, to a certain extent, has enough of a share of the car market that if they set their own standards for fuel per miles per gallon for cars, that the automakers, the car makers, might want to just say, okay, let's go with California because we don't want to make one set of cars for California and one set of cars for the rest of the country. And so that's actually what literally happened. So California took leadership around this issue, talked to a number of the different car makers, and made their own deal that for fuel efficiency with the car makers. This didn't get to the point of restoring the damage that was done by repealing Obama's climate initiative, but it made up a huge portion of the difference. So that's a story. It's a long story. It's a policy story. Now we're going to take our policy hats off. And it's an important story for thinking about New York right now in 2025. And the reason for that is because it helps to set up help us understand how New York has more power than one might expect to impact climate change. That's for a few reasons that are related to that. Number one, New York has a huge economy like California. So if New York was a country on its own, we wouldn't be the sixth largest economy, but we would be the 10th or 11th. We'd be still very much up there. Number two, New York's climate legislation has inspired similar legislation in other states, including recently around the Climate Change Superfund Act. And number three, New York emits more greenhouse gases than entire medium-sized countries. Israel, Ireland, Chile are just some random examples that I found. So the question for us is, will New York use its power to impact climate change? That's the question that is really a central question for all of us as we move through forward on this agenda. So why work on climate change right now in New York? Because of the power we have. So now I want to pass it to Noah to talk a little bit about where we're coming from and what we're currently shaping around New York's current climate policy.
Thanks, Ben. That was awesome. I'm seeing some serious accolades in the chat. So bravo. I want to take us from like why New York is important to the opportunities that we have in New York this year. And lucky for us, New York's climate movement has a history of mobilizing and working together to pass cutting edge climate legislation, like the example that Ben gave in California. So I'm also going to tell you a story, lucky us. And this is the story of passing what's known as New York's landmark climate bill, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, also known as the CLCPA.
I don't have any good tapes. We don't have them all.
I'm also going to ask that everyone stay muted, please. Thank you. Okay. So there was a period of time around 10 years ago when the world seemed to be recommitting to climate justice. We had just had the 2014 People's Climate March, the Paris Agreement was signed, and the energy in New York had turned to the need for similar kinds of recommitments to climate in our state. So the needs were outlined as the following. Establish a statewide law with mandates for climate and environmental justice to fund the transition from our fossil fuel dependent world to a green economy. In response to this need, a coalition of many faith, labor, environmental justice, and housing groups came together and built relationships and with each other, with legislators, with their bases, with the people that they organize, and they formed the New Yorker News Coalition, which is right here on the top left corner of your screen. They worked for a really long time. Actually, they worked for 4 whole years to make sure that they enacted a law that had these values that I outlined. And after 4 years, they passed, you can see on the bottom right, this is a picture of Governor Cuomo signing what I introduced as the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA, and/or what is also known as the Landmark Climate Law. And this bill was really helpful in creating landmarks. So, some of those have our electricity run on 100% green energy by 2040, setting legally binding emissions reduction standards to get New York completely off of fossil fuels by 2050, and mandating that 40% of the state's climate and energy funding be invested in disproportionately disadvantaged communities, also known as frontline communities. And it also set some intermediate goals. So by 2030, be 70% reduced of our emissions. And I don't know if anyone's checked those stats recently, but we are certainly veering off of that timeline. So and one other really important fact is within those landmarks, there was actually no investment of funding. There's no money placed into law. There's a little mute or a little echo. So if everyone could mute themselves, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so there was no money in the CLCPA. And so here are some of the ways, and so that has put us back a little bit in our progress towards achieving these goals. So what are the things that we need to reach these goals? We need three things. First of all, we need to cap our emissions. We need to reduce our emissions. And one of the vehicles that has been proposed by the governor is capping the amount that polluters can emit, requiring businesses then to get allowances that are equal to their approved greenhouse gas emissions, and then putting those funds into the state's climate action fund, which we then propose would go into certain environmental justice projects, clean energy projects, et cetera. So that program is called Cap, Trade, and Invest. That's one of the mechanisms that we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in the state and achieve our goals. We also need to pass legislation. And later in this evening, we're going to talk about some pieces of legislation that RAC New York is working on this year to pass and that Dayenu is going to also support. And as I was mentioning earlier, we need to fund climate change measures. We need to make sure that there's money in the state's budget to invest in green energy projects. It takes more than just landmarks to achieve the green economy that we really, really need. And it takes funding and implementation. These things are critical. And they will allow us to actualize the values of the CLCPA, New York's landmark climate law. So now I'm going to pass it to Ben to talk about some of the things that are at stake here and some of the reasons why it's important for us to act right now to actualize the values of the CLCPA. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Noah. So one thing just to underline from what Noah shared, we are all, whether or not we realize it, if we're committed to working on climate change in New York, we're all in the business of figuring out how to take the mandates, the goals that were set by the CLCPA, and actually making them happen, funding them, passing the laws, all the things that Noah said. And part of the reason why it's important that we show up, that we advocate, contact our legislators, all of that, is because there's actually a fight over climate change right now in New York. And I want to just take a second to share a little bit about what that fight looks like. I should say also, part of when I first started in my role here with RAC New York, I thought New York, progressive state, passing climate change legislation, do we even need advocacy and organizing? And it turns out that that was a profoundly naive way of thinking about climate policy, that in fact there is a quite extensive opposition to much of what we think is important to pass. And that's why our work is so important. So over the next few years, New York lawmakers, including Governor Hochul, our local state senators and assembly members, are going to be thinking about a number of questions for whether or not we're going to actually implement this landmark climate policy's goals in a real way. We're going to think about, are we going to stick to the goals, meaning to the timeline? They're thinking about, are we actually going to provide the level of funding? They're thinking about, are we going to pass the needed laws? And one of the things that has become particularly clear over the last few years is that on one side of the balancing act that these legislators are going to do is as I mentioned, a really forceful opposition to climate policy in New York being as strong as it could be. So I'm going to show you a few different headlines that I just have come across the desk over the last little while. Recently, this was August 2024, Governor Hochul began to explicitly ponder a relaxation of goals under New York's climate law. This was in large part thanks to a very organized attempt, mostly led by business trade associations in the fossil fuel industry, to try and convince her to ease up on the climate timeline. Another, the New York Plastics EPR bill. What's that? It's a major piece of legislation to reduce single-use plastic that is going to be actually a focus of RAC New York work this year. Last year, it came very close to passing, and a couple of factors got in the way of it moving forward as legislation. One of them was that the producers of plastics uh, did an excellent job of opposing the legislation. That's one of the reasons why it's so important that we focus on this legislation this year. Many of us who have been around in climate work over the last couple of years have known and worked on something called the New York Heat Act, which will reduce the amount of natural gas we use in our homes and our buildings. Who stands to lose when we reduce the amount of natural gas in our homes and buildings? Gas utilities. And so over the last few years, gas utilities, in particular groups like National Fuel, which is in the Buffalo area, have been extraordinarily effective at delaying, weakening, or even blocking the passage of legislation like that. Recently, I just saw this article, this headline, which I really stuck out to me, which was a business rep from a business trade association referring to New York's green energy law. That's the CLCPA thing that we're talking about here, as asinine, which was a particularly sharp way of framing it. So, all right. New York's opponents to strong climate policies include certain gas utilities, fossil fuel companies, business trade associations, including in particular the Business Council of New York State, and a bunch of groups that sort of sound like they're about one thing, but are actually about another thing, including New Yorkers for Affordable Energy, which is a mostly fossil fuel company funded organization opposing climate laws in New York State. So going back to our scales and the decisions that lawmakers need to make. On the one side, all of these opponents are weighing heavy right now on climate policy in New York. Gas utilities, fossil fuel companies, other opponents are actively in the ear of our elected officials. And the reason why it's important that we act and are a part of this effort to ensure that New York leads on the climate issue is that we've got to be on the other side of that balancing equation. We'll get into more of what that looks like and how everybody in this call can find a role to be a part of this. But in general, this is the setup of why it's so important that we weigh in and make our voices heard with our policymakers. So with that, I want to just pass it back to Noah. We're going to do one more section before we have a chance to talk in breakouts. So about the importance of climate and environmental justice. Noah, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Ben. That was awesome. So one of the other things that is preventing us from achieving the important pieces of the CLCPA is the kind of societal issue of inequities in our state around access to clean air, clean water, all these different pieces. The main component, or one of the main components of the CLCPA, is environmental justice. So I'm curious to take like one or two definitions that people have of environmental justice in the chat. If anyone wants to just throw in off the top of your head, what's the first kind of definition that you have? Well, it's already up here. Okay, great. If you want to put it in your own words, that's great. But due to racism and class discrimination and all the other inequities that we have in our society, communities of color and income communities are disproportionately exposed to environmental harm. So that could be exposure to toxic pollution, unequal health impacts like asthma and lung disease, noise pollution, land use issues, et cetera, et cetera. And the concept of environmental justice, as it says on this slide, is about narrowing this disparity under the law, ensuring that everybody has access to clean air, clean water, et cetera, and a livable place. And then when we add this giant climate crisis to these disparities, we get something called environment or climate justice. So you can actually go to the next slide and we can read a quote. Great. Can I have one reader come off mute and read this quote? I'm going to ask actually Sharon Kosakoff to come off and read this for us.
Climate change is the biggest environmental justice crisis of the 21st century. Robert Bullard. Takeaway,
Great, thank you,
environmental
Sharon.
justice includes but is not limited to climate justice.
There we go. Thank you so much. So Robert Bullard is an environmental justice thinker, an elder, and he said this very poignant thing, which is that climate change will impact everybody, but it will not impact everybody equally. And the people who contribute the least to emissions and pollution will likely be impacted the most by the impacts of a hotter, wetter planet. Okay. So it's actually one of like the really interesting things that New Yorker News just did research on is that many New Yorkers overwhelmingly support climate justice legislation and the CLCPA. So you can read this in the next slide. So here it says that 64% of New Yorkers support the CLCPA. And 72% of voters who actually learn about the specifics of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA, support the legislation. And that's huge. When we're thinking about organizing and making change in the state, often the biggest hurdle is mobilizing people around it. But the fact that we have kind of like broad support around this legislation means that our work here is, we're ready. We can make the change happen. The goals of the CLCPA ultimately are to reduce the emissions of our state to zero by 2050. And in order to do that, we need to invest money in green infrastructure in low-income Black and Brown and Indigenous communities so that we can ensure we are all protected and brought along in our transition to this green economy. All right.
My name's Cliff Fonstein. I live in Brooklyn, and I'm a member of the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue, and I'm also a member of RAC New York and have been involved in their climate campaigns over the last several years. We all know the dangers of global warming, and we've heard today about the importance of the landmark 2019 Climate Act, the hard work of the broad coalition that worked to pass that act, and the big impact we can have here in New York to help the potential for climate catastrophe. You've also heard about the attacks on the 2019 climate law, largely funded by the oil and gas industry. Now we'll talk about some of the things that we, as New York Jews, can do to protect and meet the goals of the 2019 Climate Act and to ensure a livable future for our children. I'll turn it over to Jesse.
All right, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessie Thompson with the Dayenu in the Heights Circle here in Washington Heights, Upper Manhattan. And so as Noah and Ben outlined earlier, we are really in a moment of opportunity to push our elected officials to ensure that we achieve the goals of the CLCPA. This year, we have a chance to push forward a cap, trade, and invest program, which would cap the amount of emissions from corporate polluters, make them pay for the emissions that exceed that cap, and direct that money into a dedicated climate action fund. Unfortunately, as many of you know, in her State of the State address last week, Governor Hochul unilaterally decided to delay implementing this system by a year. And as we say in the climate movement, when elected officials delay critical climate legislation, it's akin to denying the urgency of the crisis. So this year, Dayenu is seeking to ensure that this program gets put into place and that at least 40% of the $2.6 billion of revenue generated from it would go to frontline communities, those communities that get hit first and worst by the effects of climate and environmental injustice. We can't let Hochul get away with denying the urgency of this moment and delaying the critical investments into frontline communities and the investments into infrastructure that will ensure a just, livable future for all New Yorkers for generations to come. At our next teach-in, as Cliff already mentioned, we will talk more about how you can take action with us this session. And if somebody can drop a sign-up info in the chat, I would love it if you all could take a moment and sign up for February 11th right now. So while somebody pops that in the chat, we're going to move on to the action that we're going to take together tonight. I am sure you're as frustrated as I am by the governor's inaction on climate so far this year. We're going to make calls. We're going to call her right now, urging Governor Hochul to ensure that New York's regulatory bodies roll out the Cap, Trade, and Invest program this year. In her State of the State address, Governor Hochul talked a lot about affordability. That seems to be her new mantra. Well, investment in renewable energy makes energy more affordable in the long run. It does require a little bit of outlay at the beginning, but we will be paying so much more if we stick with fossil fuel energy, both in terms of paying for that energy and in terms of paying for the climate damage that is caused by burning fossil fuels. So we're all going to get together, get your phones out. We're going to call Governor Hochul, because the more people who make this call all at the same time, the more likely she'll hear our message. We are calling after hours, so you will be leaving a message rather than speaking to an operator. Hopefully you'll be able to get through. If you get a message that the number is experiencing a heavy call volume, copy down the number and the script, into a note for yourself and try again a bit later. So we have the numbers, both her Albany number and the NYC number in the chat. And let's take our phones out, make sure you're on mute, and let's take a couple of minutes to make this call.
I know when you're done, you can just put an emoji in the chat to let us know that you finished making your call. Okay, so I think we're seeing lots of dones. If you haven't finished up your calls, you can feel free to do so, or, save the number to call again later. And I will pass it back over to Cliff, I believe.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about RAC New York's plans. This year, along with Dayenu, New York Renews, and other religious and environmental groups, RAC New York will be working to defend the 2019 Climate Act from the efforts of the oil and gas industry to undermine it. We'll be doing whatever it takes to preserve the Climate Act, whether it's working to pass legislation, attending regulatory hearings, or emailing, calling our politicians. RAC New York will also work to make sure that the New York State's climate efforts are adequately funded. For example, working to ensure that the state has an effective and equitable Cap and Invest program. Noah described the importance of these funding efforts earlier. Finally, RAC New York will be concentrating its efforts on passing two key pieces of climate legislation, the New York Heat Act and the Packaging Reduction Recycling Infrastructure Act, which, to save time and get us out on time, I'll call the Plastics Act. I want to spend a few minutes talking about both of these bills. The first bill, the New York Heat Act, is a potentially transformative law. It will make energy more affordable while at the same time reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Our current decades-old energy laws and regulations are antiquated and dysfunctional. They date from the last century when the oil and gas industry pitched what they called natural gas as the key to a good life. Maybe it was true then, maybe not. But they've left us today with two fundamental problems that the Heat Act seeks to redress. The first problem is that this outdated system exacerbates our current climate crisis. In New York State, the gas used to heat our buildings is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, comprising about 30% of all emissions in the state. That's more emissions than are emitted by the transportation sector. When gas service is more available to the exclusion of other sources of energy because our current laws give preference to gas, more of our buildings will use gas, and that means more greenhouse gas emissions. To cut down on these emissions, we need to encourage utilities and individuals to use other cost-effective energy resources. Part of this means getting rid of the outdated preferences for gas, preferences that inevitably work to expand the gas system. The second problem with the current system is that it's too expensive. The high cost of energy has reached a crisis level in New York State. Last winter, 1.4 million New Yorkers struggled to pay energy bills. The lowest income households spent 15% of their income on paying their energy bills. This problem will grow over time as the price of renewable energy sources decline. Gas companies will continue to lose paying customers. To make up for that lost revenue, gas companies will then stick those who are stranded in the gas system, mostly low-income New Yorkers, with higher and higher energy bills. The current regulatory system has all sorts of dated incentives and preferences that encourage the expansion of the gas systems. Those preferences make no sense. It'd be as if the government incentivized people to buy large fleets of horses and buggies in 1908, the year the Model T car was released. The New York Heat Act seeks to resolve these problems. It would ensure that no one in New York State pays more than 6% of their income on energy bills. It would also end the existing preferences that encourage the expansion of the gas system. For example, it would get rid of the 100-foot rule. This rule gives anyone within 100 feet of a gas main a free hookup to that gas main. Except this free hookup is not really free. Existing ratepayers pay for these so-called free hookups to the tune of $200 million a year. The Heat Act gets rid of these outdated preferences like the 100-foot rule. It's the first step in creating a managed, well-planned system that's safe, affordable, and reliable. The plastic bill is the second bill we'll be working on. It will gradually reduce plastic packaging by 30% over the next 12 years, and it requires 70% of the remaining packaging to be reused and recycled. Plastic never dissolves. It only breaks down into ever smaller pieces that are now found to pollute our hearts, our lungs, and even the blood of newborns. Plastic packaging is also a major source of climate pollution. New York's waste sector accounts for 12% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. We New Yorkers are pretty good at reducing our waste. We reuse what we can and we recycle. Our current system, however, is not meeting our environmental demands. The Plastic Act, which shifts some of the onus for recycling from our communities and us as individuals to the producers of the products to ensure that they are also working to solve the plastic problem. Thus far, 4 states have implemented similar programs, and New York must follow suit. If you're interested in supporting these 2 key bills and the other Dayenu and Rep New York initiatives that we've been discussing today, I urge you to attend our follow-up teach-in on February 11th. We'll be discussing the strategies that we can use to protect the 2019 Climate Act and strategies that we could use to enact other needed changes. You can, for example, email legislators, attend meetings with legislators, and go to rallies across the state, and there'll be a link in the chat where you can begin to participate in some of these efforts. And you'll hear on February 11th that when we act together, our power can be unstoppable. As the old saying goes, dollars don't vote, people do. Our state legislators and the governor intuitively understand this, and that's where our power lies. Now I'd like to pass it on to Gabriel Lehrman, a cantorial student at HUC, to close us out with a song.
Okay, that's me. Thanks so much, Cliff. It's nice to hear all about that. I know that we're a little bit past time too, so if anybody needs to get going, I won't take any offense. You can do what you need to do. It's late. It's been a long and cold day, so enjoy it. But also, if you want to end today in song, in prayer, then please stick around, and we're gonna do that. I'm gonna I'm gonna put the lyrics into the chat, and then I'm going to turn the chat off for myself so that I don't see if other people have stuff to say. But I wanted to end us with a prayer that really comes from it's called "More Waters Rising" by someone named Sarah Lynch Thomason. She's a folklorist who comes from the Asheville area, and so thinking about some of the fires and some of the waters that have been impacting us over the last year, I felt like it was important to bring her voice into this space and do this. As Cliff said, my name is Gabriel. I am a fifth-year cantorial student at Hebrew Union College, and I live in Brooklyn. And I'm really glad to be here, and I'm gonna be there on February 11th. So looking forward to seeing you there too. So while we get ready for this, if we want to bring ourselves, if everybody wants to join me, you're welcome to listen or participate, but I encourage participation. And in order to do that, the first thing we got to do is just snap. All right, seeing a couple people snapping. That's great. Here we go. And as you get used to it, join in. There are more waters rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more waters rising, they will find their way to me. There are more waters rising, this I know, this I know. There are more waters rising, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know. There are more fires burning, they will find their way to me. There are more fires burning, this I know, this I know. There are more fires burning, this I know. I will rebuild. I will wade through the fires, this I know, this I know. I will walk through the fires, this I know. I will walk through the fires when they find their way to me. I will walk through the fires, this I know, this I know. I will walk through the fires, this I know. I will wade through the waters, this I know, this I know. I will wade through the waters, this I know. I will wade through the waters when they find their way to me. I will wade through the waters. This I know, this I know, I will wade through the waters. This I know.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Gabriel. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you all.